Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have the great pleasure to welcome Professor André Muniz. Professor Muniz works as a professor at University Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, URGS. Professor Muniz got his PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His main research interest is related to computational material science, focused on nanomaterials. More specifically, his research group applies state-of-the-art computational methods to compute the physical properties of nanomaterials, explore their behavior in potential practical applications, and propose novel functional nanostructures with tunable properties using open source codes such as Quantum Espresso and LAMMPS. He's currently involved in research in the area of computational material science in carbon-based nanomaterials. He has published around 50 articles and several conference papers, adding up to around 700 citations. He is also author of 2 patents on multi-layer graphene structures. So welcome, Professor Muniz. Thank you very much for being here. Please feel free to start your talk.
Okay, thank you for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on the time zone you are. So I'll share my screen.
Sure.
And you guys tell
It's
me
coming.
if it's okay.
Yep.
Yep, can you see?
Yes.
Fred, how much time do I have?
Well,
Forgot to ask
45,
you.
40 minutes, 45. I leave time
Okay.
for questions.
All right. So the title of my talk, it was hard to find a title, but it's Insights on Computational Material Science at Atomic Scale. See, here is an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk briefly about the use of atomistic simulation tools in computational material science and present some examples of applications from research group. I will talk more about later. And some research on carbon nanothreads, formation of a carbon molecular sieve membranes from pyrolysis of polymers, and the study of the mechanical caloric effect in organic materials. So our university, for those who don't know, it's in Porto Alegre, the capital of Rio Grande do Sul, the southernmost state of Brazil. Here's the top view of our central campus. Here we have Porto Alegre downtown. We have here a traditional park in Porto Alegre called Redenção. We are in the midst of everything here. So in our group, we apply both classical and quantum atomistic calculations to study existing, modified, or novel carbon-based nanomaterials, and also synthesis and modification process on these materials, as well as applications. So what are those atomistic calculations? You already might know, but we can analyze the behavior and properties of materials in different ways, depending on the scales of the phenomena we are interested in. We can analyze a material from the point of view of their electrons in the most fundamental level, and for that we use theories from the quantum mechanics. We can also study the collective behavior of atoms in a solid, in a nanostructure, or molecules in a condensing phase using the tools of statistical mechanics. And we go further to the scales, larger scales, the macro level, we have applied concepts of continuum mechanics. And for each one of these levels, we have specific tools, such as in the quantum, we have the DFT, the most famous for solids, for materials, but we also use Hartree-Fock methods and its derivatives. And the molecular level have molecular dynamics and Monte Carlo. Some methods, some coarse-grained models for this gray zone in the meso microstructure. And at the end, we have those traditional finite element modeling based on continuum description of the materials. So when we talk about atomistic simulation methods in material science, we're talking about quantum mechanical based and classical mechanics based methods. So these are the most common for quantum and classical. And I'm gonna focus today only on 2 of them, the 2 that we use in our group, mostly used in our group. And also, I would say the most versatile for the type of applications we are interested in, that is density functional theory and molecular dynamics. Density functional theory calculations are essentially electronic structure calculations based in the concept of minimizing a function of energy by evaluating a function called the electron density distribution. So we start with a position of the atomic nuclei, such as here in graphene, for example. And essentially what we compute is this function N of R, which, in other words, the electronic structure, electronic distribution in the material in order to minimize this energy. So it's a problem of variational calculus. This function in its way is expressed in terms of eigenfunctions that are called the constant orbitals, that are the solutions of eigenvalue problem of an auxiliary system. So we have to solve consistently this eigenvalue problem in this variational calculus problem. They have to be solved self-consistently. But what do we do with this information? Based on these energies in the ground state, the X function, and the eigenvalues in the eigenfunctions, we can extract a lot of information, virtually any information about the properties and structure of the material. For example, we can predict the atomic structure of molecules, clusters, solids, nanomaterials, surface by finding, for example, the atomic positions of the nuclei that minimize the whole energy of the system. And with this structure, we can then, with the help of this information, we can compute, for example, the electronic properties to predict if material is a metal, an insulator, a semiconductor. We can use perturbation theory to evaluate their vibrational properties. We can include spin in these calculations to compute magnetic properties, and so on. We can apply other techniques to extract mechanical by impose different types of deformation in the material. And we can also use another techniques such as the nudge elastic band method to compute, for example, reaction paths and their related energy barriers, and many others that are interesting. These methods are considered as a first principles method because it doesn't require empirical parameters for studying a system. That's not completely true, but that's what we usually say. And these methods have a good accuracy and a good transferability. We can study a variety of systems with the same setup. Of course, there are some cons that it's due to usually in terms of the quality of the results. Some approximations are used in part of that function that I show you, the so-called exchange correlation function, that impose some limitations on the predictions that we can make about the systems, and also distinct functions can lead to different results. So we have to be very careful about the choice of this function. And also the cost of these computations are relatively high. That limits its practical use to systems with maximum few hundred atoms. So an alternative to studying higher and longer time scales and length scales is to use classical tools. So one of these methods, the classical molecular dynamic simulations, that assumes that the atoms in the system are classical bodies that evolve with time according to the equations of motion, the second law of Newton. So basically, we solve this problem starting from an initial configuration, and we get atomic trajectories of the system. So with these atomic trajectories, we can extract a lot of useful information. So we don't have explicit electrons here. So all the information about the interactions, like chemical bonds, interatomic interactions, are embedded within this function of R that we call interatomic potential or force field, that contains empirical parameters that are fitted using either quantum mechanical calculations or experimental data. So from these trajectories, as I said, we can do a lot of things. We can observe directly the system dynamics. We can see what's going on the process at a molecular level. And of course, we can also compute with the use of relationships from statistical mechanics. We can compute the energy of the system, temperature, pressure, mechanical stresses, some structural parameters, correlation functions, anything that we can extract directly from this information. And based on that, we can predict structural parameters such as crystalline structure, atomic structure in general of crystalline and amorphous materials, compute their thermodynamic properties, compute transport properties like diffusivities, mobilities, thermoconductivity. We can analyze their mechanical behavior under different kind of strain. We can apply uniaxial strain, we can apply shear, we can apply isotropic compression and compute the corresponding mechanical properties. We can also study dynamic processes involving chemical reactions with the use of reactive force fields. I'm going to show a little bit about that later, and many others as well. So of course there are pros and cons again. It's it has a lower cost compared to quantum tools, so it enables to study systems up to 1 million of atoms, up to microsecond long with supercomputers. And there are a rich variety of empirical interatomic potentials which enable us to model systems of varied complexity, and real experiments can be simulated, at least an attempt to it, as I'll show later in my examples, but on a shorter time scale than those typically used in laboratory. That's limited, of course, by the time scale of the phenomenon we are able to investigate. There are some cons that there is no information about electrons, so any property of the material that requires a knowledge about the electrons, we can obtain. And of course, we need an empirical potential that is properly parameterized for that application, for that material. They usually exhibit some limited transferability. So we have to be very careful with the choice of this force field and to get accurate results. All the accuracy, most of the accuracy of the calculations, we could say that it's due to a good choice of this interatomic potential. And of course, as we have some limitation on the time scale that can be achieved, some phenomena that are of interest may not be observed in the simulation unless we do something different. We accelerate the phenomena to be observed. So what's the idea of using these techniques then in computational material science? When we go to a lab, to a real lab, what we usually do? We get some raw material, we sit and synthesize the material. So we use different characterization techniques to get some information about their structure, their functionality. So that's what we do, but using a computer. There's a term that has been increasingly used by researchers in the field that we do experiments in silico, in silico lab. That's the term that we have been using. So we do the equivalent of experiments. For example, I can tell my computer what elements are present in that material, how they arrange with each other, what are the rules that they must follow, either by quantum or classical mechanics, according to the techniques I'm using. And of course, the computer will do all the necessary calculations and will give us the material, the equivalent to the synthesis. So we get the atomic structure of the material as well, the electronic structure, depending on the technique we are using. And with this information, we can apply a lot of techniques to get their physical properties. For example, we can compute electronic properties, compute band gaps. That is interesting for many applications in electronics and in optical devices. We can compute magnetic, chemical properties of this material. We can evaluate mechanical tests. For example, we can strain the material and compute the maximum stress it can withstand before breaking. We can analyze in details fracture, for example, fracture mechanisms of these materials, and so on. So we can get a lot of information that is not easily obtained in experiments. So what's the deal? When we use the setup of using the computer as a laboratory, as an in silico laboratory, a virtual laboratory, it allows us to investigate existing materials and processes that already exist, but aiming at a deeper understanding, a fundamental understanding, obtaining information not easily accessible by experiments. In this case, we can manipulate the atoms, we can observe the phenomena going on at molecular level, but we can also use these tools to predict, to search for novel materials, and evaluate their set of physical properties even before they are synthesized in the lab, enabling then new technologies. We can know a lot about the materials even before going to the lab. So this kind of study can also motivate experimental studies toward the development of new materials and, of course, new applications. And one important point here is that these calculations themselves are okay, but it's important to carry out them in synergy with experiments. That's the way we combine the information that you get with experiments and the information we get from the computer. The combination of both will lead to a comprehensive understanding of the relevant phenomena in system properties. So that's what I'm going to show in our examples. I'm going to show 3 different projects we've been working on. I chose these 3 because they are different in the sense that we are using similar tools to do completely different things. All of them related, of course, to experiments. I will start with design. I'll talk about some research in carbon nanothreads. But before, just show the softwares that we use in our group. All the calculations that I'll show here were done either with quantum espresso in case of DFT, LAMMPS for MED, And for pre and post-processing, we use Ovito, JMol, and Scilab. Important to mention, all of them open source softwares. And for the computationals, you use some personal computers and, of course, the help of two supercomputers, CESUP at our university and LNCC in Rio de Janeiro. So let's start talking about these carbon nanothreads, also named diamond nanothreads in the beginning. They are another member of the family of carbon nanomaterials. Carbon nanotubes are famous graphene, so carbon nanothreads are the sp3 equivalent one. So they have been synthesized for the first time in 2014, and the idea is to get crystalline benzene and make the rings fuse to each other, forming a continuous strand that they labeled as a nanothread. Here are some images of the original paper. So they describe the structure of these nanothreads as this first work as a combination of two theoretical structures that had been predicted before, that are essentially formed by this procedure, stacking benzene molecules and establishing covalent bonds in the neighboring atoms. So these materials, they have a remarkable set of mechanical properties similar to other carbon nanostructures. So here are some properties that we compute in a previous study using density functional theory calculations. And besides being quite strong, they have a flexibility. They are quite flexible to the nature of the chain. They are lightweight. They have a good thermal conductivity. They are insulators from an electronic point of view, and other properties to be investigated yet. And actually, some studies that show that there are a huge variety of structures that can be formed from the stacking of benzene molecules. This theoretical study predicted 50 possible configurations, and they differ on the topology of the benzene rings when they fuse to each other. And experiments revealed that indeed these materials made in laboratory are actually a mix of these different configurations. What is interesting that is depending on the arrangement of the benzene rings, we can have completely different properties for these materials. What enables us in the future, maybe if we can control the structure of these materials, we can have a fine control of their properties. But it's still an active field of research. We'll wait for some time until we get there. There are several potential applications that have been suggested in computational studies by several groups, such as fillers in reinforced nanocomposites, very strong nanofibers. They are used also in mechanical energy storage devices as nanoresonators for the development of accurate sensor, also as a way of enhancing heat transfer in nano device, and so on. So what was our interest in these materials? One of the questions we asked when we saw the first study was, of course, they could make with benzene. Was it possible to use other molecules to produce these materials? For example, if you replace benzene by a benzene derivative or a heterocyclic molecule, aromatic. So why it would be nice? Because we are introducing functional groups on this material that would, of course, alter the properties of these nanothreads for good or for bad. So our idea was to use these first principles calculations to analyze the possibility of creating carbon nanothread-like materials using a variety of other precursor molecules. So we started with this one, and what we did, just to repeat the image I showed before, we tell the computer which molecules we have, from the experiments, what are the different ways they can bond to each other, and essentially we try to predict what are the possible atomic structures that they might have, if they are stable, if we could get hints on possible formation to analyze if they could be obtained in laboratory. Also, we could evaluate some of their properties. They would be insulating, like the benzene-derived semiconductors, and we wanted to check if they were as strong as the benzene derivative derived nanothreads. And the answer was yes. In the study, we could find a huge variety of structures that can be formed, quite similar to the benzene-derived, but containing these functional groups distribute in different ways. And these groups can be either on the surface or within the chain as heteroatoms. And that, of course, affected the properties. But one important find is that the mechanical properties that are very good for these nanothreads are maintained. So here is an example of a stress-strain curve on which we strain the material and we compute the resulting stress. until we reach this maximum value. That's the fracture point. So we can get their ultimate strength and the fracture strength. Usually when you functionalize a nanomaterial, such as carbon nanotubes and graphene, you are changing the hybridization of the bonds, and that makes the material weaker. So this strength usually decreases by 50%, 20%, and sometimes even by 1 order of magnitude. In this case, as we maintain the same type of hybridization in the main chain, the decrease is not significant. That was a very interesting and important finding. In terms of electronic properties, we are always searching for new semiconductors. These materials are usually insulating. Most of them are insulating, but the ones based on pyridine, that heterocyclic molecule, had a smaller, narrower band gap due to the introduction of electronic states within the gap due to the heteroatoms within the chain, a sort of a doping effect, we could say, in this material. And of course, the presence of these groups enhanced the interaction with polar materials. What is interesting, for example, when we talk about nanocomposites, we are enhancing the interaction with the polymer, and also would enable their use in solvent-based techniques for processing of these materials. We can use, for example, other polar solvent that we could use existing techniques to apply the processing of these materials, for example, depositing on a surface or something like that. And in the following study, we did similar thing with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon molecules. The most well-known maybe naphthalene, anthracene, coronium. And we wanted to check if it was possible to create and what type of structures could be formed. And yes, we could find a huge variety of structures, even richer, because the number of reactive sites compared to benzene is higher. So instead of 6 sites or 3 sites, we have like 10 sites here for establishing these interconnections. So we could predict a series of carbon nanothreads. Most of them are more stable than the precursor molecules. Some can exist as metastable structures. What's quite common in nanotechnology, sometimes we have structures that are metastable with a mechanism of formation controlled by kinetics. And some mechanical properties are indeed enhanced. Some of them are maintained the same. We use as the 2 examples, the tube 30 and the polymer 1, that are the traditional models for nanothreads based on benzene. We can see that most of them are within this range, but some properties are enhanced. We can stretch them at higher degrees and even bend them much more than this, exhibit a bending model so it's substantially higher than this derived from simply for benzene. So we have some enhanced properties for these materials. And we also could use these tools to investigate possible formation mechanisms to see if it was possible to form them, and we could establish some possible pathways leading to different products that we predict in that first part of the study, as well some possible byproducts, some routes that are undesired, but of course they need to be considered as well. So these studies were all predictive. We just get insight from these initial experiments with benzene. We tried using the computer to create the most a collection of possible nanothreads using the same idea. And interestingly, 1 year, 2 years after, a lot of groups started reporting the production of synthesis of nanothreads from these molecules, from pyridine, from aniline, and here from both. In their materials, the structure of these materials are in excellent agreement with predictions we made. So it was very satisfying for us, because for those who work with computations, it's always nice to see predictions, your calculations matching things in reality. So it was very satisfying, very exciting. And also they could do the same for naphthalene and anthracene. The difference that they had to use a fluorinated version in form of co-crystals to facilitate the reaction between the rings. But the materials, the structure of the materials and the properties are in very good agreement with what we predict. So it's an example of a project on which we predict the materials and later they were obtained in laboratory. Yeah, we continue studying this material and try to show that this concept of covalent bonding between aromatic molecules could be extended to form 2D and 3D materials, not only filaments, but cross-linked networks of these materials. So we propose different ways of doing that using the existing structures already synthesized of carbon nanothreads, and if we use polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon molecules of different sizes. In both cases, we could get to structures very interesting, very beautiful. Here's an image, one of them. These materials are all formed by sp3 carbon. They are intrinsically nanoporous, with a narrow pore size distribution, and we labeled them nanomeshes for the 2D case and nanofoams for the 3D. And we did some mechanical tests, and besides having a low density, a high surface area, they exhibit a high flexibility and a high strength, in the same order of magnitude of the mechanical strength of the nanothreads. So we're talking a material that is as flexible as a polymer, for example, and is much stronger than a metal. So it's an unusual material, thanks to this intrinsic type of carbon-carbon bond in these structures. Of course, this is all predictions, and we are still waiting to see if someone can make them in laboratory. That would be very nice, and many applications could be envisioned for them. One application that we thought about, due to the intrinsic nanoporous structure, is naturally to use them as membranes. But these mechanical tests allow to observe something interesting, that when we apply the strain, the size and the shape of the spores change. So the idea was, if we get some of these materials and we apply strain on them, we can see a change on the morphology and the size of the pores. For example, here I show in more details one of these pores. If we apply an axial strain, here you are inserting the largest sphere that can be fitted within this space. So it starts, for example, with an effective diameter of 8.8. But when we applied strain, we observe this material deforming, leading to a decrease on this pore size, until we can reach values close to the kinetic diameter of many gases, for example, of many molecules. So the idea in this case was to check if these materials could be used as nanoporous membranes, but with a difference. With pore size, and of course, membrane performance tuned by the application of strain. There are a lot of studies on nanoporous graphene and other 2D materials, so we did same kind of study, but with this difference. We can tune the pore size by the application of the strain. You can stretch this membrane and change their permeation properties. So we did some MD calculations to compute the transport through these membranes for mixtures and pure gases. Here in this example where we show the separation of nitrogen and oxygen, it's a difficult separation in practice due to the very close kinetic diameter of these molecules. So we compute transfer rates, and with this information, we compute a lot of properties of relevance like permeabilities and selectivities. And we found that by applying strain in these membranes, these are two different membranes, we can tune, of course, as we show, the size of the spores. But most importantly, here we have the selectivity that we can obtain as a function of strain. We can increase significantly the selectivity of this membrane by straining the material. So beyond a certain critical level, we see a significant increase on the selectivities. And these selectivities are similar or higher than those that are typical of conventional materials. It showed a behavior similar to other nanoporous materials, but with this difference that we can tune the pore size. Here's a plot of the selectivity versus the permeability. Ideally, we want materials that are in this corner. They have a high permeability and high selectivity. There's a limit that is followed by most of the membranes used in practice, the polymeric membranes. And we can see that our material was able to cross this limit for specific conditions. So it was very nice. We also recently published a study that we applied these membranes for water desalination as well. So it's a promising material, but again, it has to be made in laboratory. They haven't achieved so far. So that completes the part of my talk. And I wanted to show how to use this calculation as predictive tools, not only to predict the structure and property, but also applications. So before synthesizing the material, we know a lot about them and what they can be used for. So I'll go to the next part of my talk. It's the analysis of carbon molecular sieve membranes formation. So what are those carbon molecular sieve membranes? Usually these membranes are produced from a precursor polymer. So we have a polymer rich in atomic rings. we expose this polymer to high temperatures in an inert atmosphere. And at the end, we have a carbonaceous pore structure with pores in the range of angstroms that are suitable for molecular sieving. So these membranes have been studied for, let's say, a couple of decades already, but their mechanisms of formation are not completely understood. And much of the knowledge about the control of pore size distribution, degree of gravitation is empirical. It's purely empirical. And details of the atomic structure of this nanoporous materials, they are not straightforward to extract from conventional experimental techniques. So what was the idea? This work has been conducted in collaboration with an experimental group from our university, the Laboratory of Membranes, and now it's being sponsored by Petrobras. And these are some images of what they do in the lab. They get a ceramic tube, they cover it with the polymer, then expose to higher temperatures for minutes up to hours in a furnace, and at the end, we have the formation of this dark material. And the question is, what do we have there? Of course, in the experiments, they use a series of techniques to characterize their morphology, their crystallinity, the fraction of disorder in crystalline carbon, their composition. So we get some very nice images in these studies. But we can get much more than that in terms of details of the structure. So what was our idea in this first study was to combine these techniques with simulation. So we can use more specifically molecular dynamic simulations to improve our understanding of the structural properties of the material and help elucidating the reaction mechanisms responsible for the conversion from a polymer to this kind of membrane, and characterize, of course, the membrane at the end, and evaluate how these properties change with the variation of the processing conditions. So in terms of methodology, we use reactive MD simulations using the REACTS force field. It's a force field that allows the description of formation in bracket of chemical bonds. We use the parameterization that was developed to the degradation of organic nitrogenated organic materials, the closest that we could find for our material with very good predictions. And what we did was apply a series of NVT simulations emulating a pyrolysis protocol. The difference is that we have to use higher temperatures due to the lower time scale that we can achieve. Usually they use temperatures in there as high as 1000 K for minutes to hours. To get this transformation to happen in nanoseconds, we are using temperatures in this range. It's a quite common approach in reactive molecular dynamics. These simulations for 10 nanoseconds, 10 million time steps, these interatomic potentials are quite expensive, so this is a very long and costly simulation. But it's worth doing it, so what we did was repeat the experimental approach, but using simulations. So we create an atomistic model for the polymer, and then we heat it up as it would happen in the furnace. So here's a movie of the part of the simulation. We can see in the beginning the polymer chains expand. Maybe it's not easier to see, but I'll show some details later. And we can see some gas molecules being formed, being released. So this, after time passes, these polymer chains break. The fragments start reacting with each other, forming a continuous structure. I'll accelerate a little bit, where we can see some graphitic planes being formed slowly. And then this process proceeds until at the end, we get a structure like that. We remove the molecule gases. So here's a view of an atomistic model for a carbon molecular sieve membrane obtained directly from the pyrolysis of the polymer. They have all the features that are expected. They have this graphitic defective in the graphene network. We have stacked planes. We have pores of varied diameters. We have functional groups. So with these simulations, we can get and analyze and get much more information that could be done in experiment. For example, you can get understand more about the nature of the pores that are formed, what are the typical sizes, what are the typical composition. And now this is an image of our first study. What we're doing now is doing a more comprehensive analysis of this phenomena. So we are using post-processing tools to analyze what's going on, both from a qualitative as a quantitative point of view. From the qualitative point of view, we are monitoring what are the most relevant chemical reactions that are happening here and the structural transformations. In terms of the quantitative analysis, we can monitor the relevant structural and compositional parameters as function of time, and analyze as well the structural and morphological properties of the resulting material. In the experiments, you can only see what's going on at the beginning and at the end. We can do both, beginning, at the end, and of course, we can analyze what's going on during the process. In other words, these are information that would be very hard, I would say maybe impossible to get in an experiment. Of course, assuming that our model is correct, is accurate. So how do we do that? For the qualitative analysis, we combine a visual observation. As you saw the movie, it's not straightforward to actually to get so much information just for visual observation. But of course, we use some post-processing tools of the atomic trajectories based on the atomic topology to check which atom is bonded to any atom of the system. So we can identify the most important events. For example, the events that lead to polymer degradation. Can identify what are the ways that the polymer, the precursor polymer breaks, what are the reactive radicals, the radicals that are formed, and we can see, for example, understand better how the gas molecules are produced. They can monitor this in the experiments. These are some of the most common gases that are released in the processes, and we can get, for example, details of how it happens. There are several mechanisms. Here is one of them to illustrate. For example, we have here a chain, a radical, a chain being formed, and then you have these atoms here, a carbon atom with 2 oxygen ones. So this ring is broken, and at the end, a CO2 molecule is released. So imagine that we can do that for any gas release that's going on in the process. Of course, we can do that with the help of these post-processing tools that allows to identify and then observe the phenomenon. We can get much more insight about the development and growth of this carbonaceous matrix. That's the most interesting part. Once you have these radicals, how do they combine to get a full continuous structure? So there are a lot of reactions that we could observe here. I just show one example. 2 radicals formed from the degradation of polymer. They meet each other. In the first step, they bond, forming a chemical bond between this atom labeled 1 to 3. So they formed a larger cluster. And as time passes, what we see is that these atoms can fuse to each other, leading to the formation, for example, of this ring. And we can also continue observing later this atom here will bond to this carbon atom with a dangling bond, forming another ring. And the same happened here between these 2 atoms. So we can identify the main processes responsible for the formation of the carbonaceous structure. That's very nice. It's a huge amount of data that we're still analyzing, but we already could get some nice insight about the mechanism of formation of this carbon nanostructure, these carbon structures. From a quantitative point of view, we also can make a full analysis of the atomic trajectories in post-processing, identifying and counting the species that are present in the system, radicals or gas molecules, or the larger structure. For this larger structure, we can follow as function of time their size, their composition, their morphology. So here, for example, some snapshots of the simulation. Instead of just looking at them and seeing the characteristics, we can count, for example, the number of atoms in the large species present in the system. With that, we can estimate the growth rate as function of the processing conditions. We can compare these curves for different processing conditions. We can evaluate the presence of other heteroatoms in the system, such as oxygen, nitrogen. Experiments show that there's a fraction of these materials that remains on the structure. We can evaluate that and the way they are found, so we can correlate this information, for example, with spectroscopy techniques, infrared spectroscopy techniques. We can also follow the number of atoms of a given hybridization in the system to estimate to analyze the formation of defects, the formation of crystalline domains. In this case, the blue curves they are the carbons that are bonded in a graphitic way, and also the types of functional groups that are present in the material as function of time. We can follow the number of released molecules as function of time as well. And we can compare these curves for different conditions. So we can, for example, change the temperature or the initial density, and we can then evaluate the effect of this condition on the growth rate. We can, of course, estimate this rate of growth, and maybe using, we have tried using the extrapolation. For example, we can use Reynolds-like dependence of this growth rate with the temperature and extrapolate to the lower temperatures that we observe in the experiments. But it's all a work that is in progress. I just want to show you a different application. We are now working with this huge amount of data to figure out the subset of the most relevant reactions towards structure growth, to get a better understanding about the formation of these membranes, analyze the processing conditions, the effect of the processing conditions, both on dynamics and the final properties. And another outcome of this project that we can obtain atomic model for these membranes that are generated in the simulation. So we can get these final structures. They can't be called as a membrane because they have these huge voids here yet. Why is that? Because we are working with a system with an initial system with certain number of atoms at a constant volume. Many of the atoms are released as gas molecules in the process, as we see in the experiments, and we see the formation of these structures with large voids. What we're gonna do is use some techniques that have been published in the literature using Monte Carlo or MD or a combination of them to create atomistic models based on these fragments. Usually they use simpler fragments to create these models, like some small graphite planes. Our idea is to use these more complex structures to form these materials. And at the end, of course, it would be interesting to evaluate some properties of gas permeation using these models that would naturally contain some more realistic information. So we have some initial results, but not much to show so far. So it's a completely different problem compared to the other. We are using simulations just to get a better understanding of existing phenomena, existing processes. And that's the last one I'm going to show in 40 minutes. I'll try to be very brief, Fred. I know I'll try to give in 5 minutes the last problem. But it's a completely different one where we use the molecular simulations to understand that this phenomena. These caloric effects consist in reversible thermal responses undergone by a material as a result of applying of external field. When these external field consist of mechanical stresses, we have what we call the barocaloric by application of hydrostatic compression, elasticaloric by uniaxial strain. Basically, you deform the material, it's going to heat it up or get warmer or colder. So here one example of a device that explored the elastocaloric effect on the nickel titanium shape memory alloy. So basically, by stretching this material, it's gonna absorb or release heat, and can be used, for example, in this case, in a heat pump to increase the temperature of a current and decrease of the other one. So the application of these materials of this phenomenon is efficient solid-state cooling systems that are more efficient than the existing ones based on vapor compression. But this effect is usually associated to structural phase transitions, either by induced by pressure, either structure or the type or disorder type. But there are materials that exhibit a good mechanical caloric response, but there is no phase transitions. One example is natural rubber. So I have some collaborators that did a series of experiments that showed that the potential, the barocaloric potential of rubber, not only natural rubber, but also recycled tire rubber, they exhibit a good response superior to most of materials that have been explored in previous studies. You see materials with very different compositions. They are not straightforward to get. And this is a renewable material, it's cheap. So the idea is to understand why it's so good. Their barocaloric response is so good. So they published a series of papers demonstrating experiments this, and this is an example of the setup that they use to evaluate this potential. They basically have a hydraulic press, so they compress a sample of rubber, and they can make cycles, for example, of adiabatic compression or isothermal compression, thermal expansion tests, and the idea is to evaluate what are the variation of temperature in adiabatic reversible processes or the change of entropy and isothermal process as a function of the applied pressure and the initial temperature. That's the way they can assess how good a material is for the barocaloric effect. Both metrics have to be as high as possible for a given amount of pressure imposed. So what we did was the same line of the previous one. We create a model for the cis-1,4 polyisoprene, and we applied cycles of adiabatic compression and isothermal compression using molecular dynamic simulations. We applied the charm force field, and while we tried to emulate the experiments they did, it's a very challenging work with polymers because of the time scales that are involved. So what we tried was to see if we could reproduce the phenomena in some way and validate our predictions with experimental data. And then, if okay, as we have access to all the details of the structure and energetic changes at atomic level, try to look for possible reasons for this high effect. Why, for a given pressure, rubber heats up so much? So in our first results, we could see that the trends were correctly predicted, but there was not a quantitative agreement between the results. And the reasons that we are the glass transition temperature that's related to the mobility of the molecules was being over-predicted by simulation. So we have to run simulations at higher temperatures, trying to maintain a closest ratio of the temperature used to the glass transition temperature. And we could see a good agreement between the prediction. It's not a fitting. This is a prediction from the MED simulations and here the experiments. So we could say that, okay, we could reproduce the phenomena. Now let's try to learn more about them. Okay, my time is over. I'll be very quick. Essentially, one of the is the following. When we compress the material, there will be an increase of internal energy that's equivalent to the amount of work done. And this will result in an increase of kinetic energy that is manifested as the temperature in the macro level and potential energy. So what we found is that there is a decrease on the potential energy upon adiabatic compression. So what that means, if that was positive, the decrease due to the conservation of energy, this increase of kinetic energy would be lower. Consider it's negative, there was an increase on the kinetic energy to compensate this change, and this would result in a higher temperature of the material at the macro level. And we could evaluate them for a wide range of pressures, and you could see that for the range that they did the experiments, indeed there's a decrease in this potential energy and consequently an increase on the kinetic energy of the system. We analyzed in a different way the same process using completely different calculations, using isothermal compression cycles, and we could find using a atomistic thermodynamic model to see what's the influence of the two main effects that are responsible for this significant barocaloric effect. In this case, we can see that rubber has a high compressibility. There's significant volume changes upon pressure. So this counts favorably for this change of temperature with application of pressure and the change of entropy with application of pressure. But the interesting thing is that this other term that's related to those variations on the internal energy, usually they are positive. So they will, if they are positive, they will counter negatively. It will decrease this effect. But what we saw is that for rubber, in this range of pressures, there's a decrease on the internal energy. So it would enhance the same effect. We already have this effect due to the compressibility of material, but this effect is even enhanced due to this behavior of the internal energy. And this is due to the predominance of attractive forces in the polymer. We are compressing the polymer, there's some free volume among them. They get closer, the interaction between the chains increase, and this attractive force then led to this decrease in the internal energy. And more interestingly, we could use this for predict the response. These are experimental data. These are the predictions from our thermodynamic model using our results from the simulations, and we could get a good agreement again. And what's interesting to see is that if we can analyze the combination of each term to the total change of entropy, one would expect that the change of volume would be the most important. But no, the most important for the range of pressures we are interested in are the term associated to the internal energy of the system. So we could consider that we can get access to this detailed information about the energy of the system. We could find some explanation for this high mechanical barocaloric effect in natural rubber. And what was interesting, using this concept, we could test different materials that in our calculations and we are doing experiments. I can't say much about that now, but we are doing these experiments and we are obtaining very interesting results. And we can see that there will be a new generation of barocaloric materials based on paraffins and polymers and so on. So this is a different one where we use a different application where we used molecular simulation to understand a process that was not straightforward to understand from a microscopic point of view. So just to close my talk, just showed the same image I showed before, just to show how we can cleverly use different tools of molecular simulation to do completely different things. Basically, study existing material and processes, trying to get more information, more insight about the phenomena, about the properties, as well, in that first case, as to search for novel materials. And even before they're being synthesized in the lab, we can know a lot about them in terms of their structure, their properties, and possible applications. So just like to acknowledge sponsors of this research for the scholarships and the projects, and supercomputers, and also the guys from my lab. This is the group with some present and former members. Special thanks for the ones that did these calculations here is Julian, former PhD, Augusto, also PhD student, Caio, an undergrad, and Pedro here in finishing his master's. So thank you very much, and I'm open for questions. Sorry for taking so long in this talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Muniz. We are now open for questions. If you want to ask one, please feel free to enable your microphone. I've seen that Professor Keith Gibbons has a question. You can feel free to ask.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that very nice talk, Andre. I was wanting to ask about these nanothreads and how close they are to strictly one-dimensional systems, because in strictly one-dimensional systems, we can solve the statistical mechanics exactly. That was done by a lot of people in the 1950s and 60s. There's a very nice paper by John Barker, 1962, where he solves the equations for a 1D system or an approximately 1D system in the presence of an external field. So in your case, that external field would come from other 1D chains of carbon atoms, for example, that are surrounding a central carbon chain. So I was wondering how wide these nanothreads are and whether it might be useful to to look at how close they are to a 1D system. It's not a difficult calculation.
I don't know if I got, because when we
Andrea,
talk about,
can you open your camera, please?
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I have to think about this question, because when we say it's a 1D material in this case, because the diameter of these materials are at the same size of the size of a benzene ring. So we are talking about a diameter of a few angstroms. And I understood your question, but I'm not sure. But when you talk about computer mechanical process from the EOS, actually we are talking about the deformation of bonds. You have this chain, you have these benzene rings, and they are fused to each other. We are talking about the mechanical properties, other properties. We are talking about the deformation of these bonds. And not only deformation, but also torsion and many other kind of mechanical strain that we can impose. And it comes directly from the strength of the chemical bonds. That will be different. It will be different depending on how these benzene rings are attached to each other. So I'm not sure how we could. Of course, we could use this equation state for many other purposes, but for this particular, I don't know how to give you an answer. I don't know if I get the question. But I'll take a look at this model, this StatMech model, and see how we could use it to improve our knowledge about these nanothreads, of course.
Yeah, we have done calculations for narrow, for molecules confined in a very narrow nanotube, carbon nanotube. And although they're not strictly one-dimensional, the 1D equations work really well for thermodynamics. We haven't looked at mechanical properties, but for thermodynamics, they work quite well. So that suggests if you did a perturbation expansion of some kind, if you could think of a way to do that, then that might be, really quite accurate. And,
yeah, it's something that, of course, I'll take a look and try to understand better what we can do. That we can talk about it. We can talk about that later, of course, in more details. But I don't have much knowledge in that front to give an answer right now. That's the truth.
yeah, well, the people who worked on 1D systems in the middle of the 20th century were not engineers; they were mathematical physicists, and they were mainly enchanted by the idea of solving the equations exactly. I would say they were mostly in love with the mathematics, so it's not very well known in chemical engineering.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for the question. There's something new for me to learn and see we can apply to our systems for some purpose, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Someone has another question. Professor Fred, go ahead.
Thanks, Andrea. Very, very nice, exciting talk, and show how we can do in silicon, a serious silicon study to predict some behavior and to suggest some new material. So I enjoy a lot. Let me ask you something. In the sense of these nanothread materials, in 1D, can you control the variety? We have a variety of product, maybe. Can you synthesize only one structure? Or is kind of we have a problem after all to have to separate those materials that are very complicated, very similar in sense of separation process?
Yeah, the research on nanothreads is still young. There are very few groups that are able to synthesize because of the complexity. You have to apply compression of these crystals, and most of the studies before that, usually it leads to amorphous materials. You can get those very ordered nanothreads. Usually they are, you form these filaments and they are all packed in a hexagonal way. And it's very hard to get these materials. So there are not much groups work on that so far. There, I would say 4 or 5 groups that are able to synthesize these materials. And so far, usually when they apply techniques, characterization techniques, it's hard to get a single type of structure. They get usually a mixture. And what is more challenging, in the same chain, you can have a mixture. For example, you can have like a polycrystalline domain. So you have a certain type of domain, then you have a defect, and then the configuration changes, and so on. So to control precisely this atomic bonding is still in the horizon. Some advances were found recently. I didn't show because I know I won't have much time. But they're using what's interesting was published last year and this year, and we just published a theoretical paper on that as well. They're using five-membered heterocyclic compounds like furan and thiophene. So you have a 5-membered ring and 1 heteroatom. In this case, you have only 4 reactive sites. And because of the topology of the molecules, there are not many possibilities for you to fuse them. So in this case, they are getting materials with a more precise control of the structure because there are, let's say, less chances for these molecules to bind to each other. So the structures are usually have a more crystalline order. And also, what is interesting, because of these functional groups, they are able to achieve the synthesis in lower pressures. So it's the first time that they are talking about producing in large scale. So I didn't time to show that because we didn't predict. Yeah, actually our paper came after the the synthesis, but we could explore the properties. It was very interesting because some of these materials can behave as semiconductors with good mobility, so it can open a completely new opportunity for these nanothreads. But to control the precise structure of these materials is still a challenge for the experiment.
My other question is, I enjoy a lot to see the structure of 3D material. I wonder, have you ever tried to do adsorption on these materials? I'm thinking about if you can control the size of the pore. There is one separation that may be interesting is methane nitrogen. That's a challenging separation at at normal temperature. It's easy to separate these two materials, two components at very low temperature, like minus 100 something. It's very easy doing cryogenic separation, but at normal temperature, it's very challenging to separate methane to nitrogen. Because the van der Waals interaction is very similar at normal temperature, and also the size are very similar. So, so it's a very, very tough problem, and even more if you the better is if you could get the nitrogen, absorb nitrogen preferentially than to methane. That normal material absorb more methane than nitrogen, but for separation process, nitrogen is the impurity material. So we need to absorb more nitrogen than methane. So I wonder if
we can work in. Yeah, that's something we can work in. Actually, we for getting ideal selectivities, we might have the data because we investigate these gases separately. Actually, we in this paper, just a proof of concept paper, we got two mixtures: is the nitrogen oxygen, that's a challenging separation, and one the most traditional hydrogen to methane to remove hydrogen from natural gas, for example. In this case, it performed quite well with very good selectivities, as I showed. But I didn't think about comparing this, doing this separation, nitrogen and methane, but it would be something interesting to check and see. Of course, the biggest issue is if they can get these materials in laboratory. In the simulations, they are amazing. They are quite strong, they are flexible, and usually this pore size distribution is very narrow and you can control by strain. But it's a matter if they will be able to achieve such such precision in laboratory. So I would say that is more like it's interesting seeing the simulations, but to get to reality, I think it's to take some time to people improve their methods to produce these nanothreads, and once they have a more precise control on the production of nanothreads, they can be able of fusing them and creating these nanomeshes. But it's work for the future. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, André. I have another question, but I want people ask so we can come back later.
Okay.
Professor Richard wrote some questions on the chat. Would you like to?
I saw here. Okay, I have a few questions.
Richard can ask.
Okay, the first question: can nudge elastic band be used to infer distinctions between H bonding and polarizability? I'll leave that to the end. I wouldn't know how to answer this question because it would depend not on the nudge elastic band is just a method that helps you can couple to a classical potential or to a quantum mechanical calculation just to get pathways along a diffusion pathway or a reaction pathway. So I wouldn't know how to use them to infer to make those distinctions. The second question: band gap is reduced by substitute period. Yes, it was confirmed. They have some in those papers that I showed. One of them measuring directly some electronic properties. Indeed, they have a lower band gap. That was nice. as well. They confirmed the formation of these materials, and their band gaps were lower. Actually, the presence in these materials I was talking before, when you have the sulfur and the oxygen within the chain in this 5-member heterocyclic derived nanothreads, we have even lower band gaps, especially in the case of sulfur, because of the interaction between the appended groups. So this leads on the electronic dispersion, inserts energy levels within the band gap that decrease significantly down to 1 point something, so much closer to the range of semiconducting properties that it's desired for applications. And the other one was for the stretched membrane simulation. Yeah, the simulation, these initial simulations we kept rigid, of course. And something that we have to do, not only for gas, but also one recent paper that we did on desalination, is to see how hydraulic pressure would affect the power size. I'd say that for gases, I would say that maybe we wouldn't see much difference for the range of pressures. Of course, we would have to investigate this, but in all the simulations, these first simulations, we get the membrane, so we stretch them, then we relax them at that given strain, and then we kept rigid during the permeation simulations.
Okay, thank you. Nice presentation.
Thank you, Richard.
Do we have another question?
Let I ask one.
Fred, you are always full of questions, so I know you have more.
Go ahead, Professor Fred.
So but it's about the pyrolysis part. I was fascinating this study, but in order to have the time scale feasible, you have to increase a lot the temperature.
Yep.
And this worry me, because could you explain the same phenomena at so high temperature when compared to low temperature? Maybe the phenomenon that you are seeing at this level of temperature, maybe it's not the same as at low temperature.
Yeah.
So I wonder this. Well, suppose that you are making like a membrane. If you do the membrane at the region that mechanically it is unstable, so have a very high driving force to make the membrane. The structure of the membrane is going to be completely different if you do the membrane at the region that there's no instability, mechanical instability. So it's happened a lot when you crystallize. Is a very strong driving force. The crystal structure maybe is completely different from if you not have the driving force as we're talking about. So I can see this in dynamic, that the dynamic path maybe is completely different if you have a very strong drive force compared to low driving force. So I wonder if you can explain the mechanism or the phenomenon that you are looking at very high temperature, the same as at low temperature. So it's a curiosity.
There's a very pertinent question, because of course in the experiments we have many other processes going in different levels. We are talking about seconds to hours to get the formation of the membrane. And of course, it's impossible to reach using femtosecond time steps. It's impossible. So actually, you have to see these tools as just as another tool to get more insight in it. We can't claim that no, this is the mechanism. What we are doing is to get some more insight. And usually, there are hundreds of studies with reactive MD for the most varied problems in pyrolysis, combustion, and so on. And usually, normally these simulations are done in this temperature or even higher, We try to use different temperatures from 2000 to 3000 and see how the temperature changes, what are the phenomena that can happen at higher temperature that doesn't happen at lower temperatures. But usually they do that. And in many situations, what they find in the simulations are in good agreement with the experiment. Sometimes, of course, these simulations will miss some phenomena that would be impossible to get with these techniques. We have to to be humble and say, okay, there's no way of getting all the phenomena. So we can get some extra insight that we can't get from experiments. That's the main message. And one thing that's interesting, for example, I explained very quickly, maybe, I don't know if someone understood, but for example, when you get those dynamic curves, we can, for example, fit a function, for example, first order reaction, quite simple, zero order, whatever. So you can estimate the rate of these reactions, use a simple kinetic model at different temperatures, and then you can extrapolate to the temperatures near to the ones that we are using. And for the preliminary estimation that we made, we can get the same if we extrapolate this growth rates to the temperatures close to the used ones. They match, not exactly, but in the same order of magnitude. So this is an indication that some phenomena are getting properly properly being found. But of course, we can't say that is the true mechanism, because there might be many others. Because you can think also, we have a small piece of polymer. We're talking about few nanometers. So in a real process, you have the solvent, you have this gas expanding, you have bubbles of gas being released. And this, of course, will affect the microstructure of the membrane, of course. Sure. So these effects, so far, we can get. But we can get some more deep insight at in terms of reactions. I showed it's very nice to see you have a bunch of radicals and they fight each other. When they find, they try to rearrange and form continuous, beautiful structures that you can see in any book of carbon membranes. You see those images with some random graphitic planes showed. So this may be one of the first, or maybe the first images of atomic level when you can get a description more detailed. We have some studies on more focused on amorphous carbon, on carbon fibers that people pyrolyze polymers as well, but the conditions are harsher. They actually do in much higher temperatures, and the idea is just to get a graphitic material with high mechanical resistance. In this case, these polymers are diluted, so the way they grow, they have this hierarchical structure of pores in the membranes as they are formed. But of course, we can't get all the information from a single MD simulation. It's impossible. Maybe someday with powers with huge increase.
We have to do what's possible to do.
Yeah, yeah. Those are models. At the end of the day, these are models, and we can do the best we can with them.
Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you for the invitation as well.
Oh. Do we have another question? I don't think so. So I think it's time to wrap it up.
Let me ask you one more. When you say that these materials, trained materials, are made using pressure, what pressure we are talking about?
You mean the last topic, the barocaloric?
No, the nanothreads material.
Okay.
One-dimensional.
Quite high. No, you have to apply a compression, isotropic compression, the material, and the process will proceed in the direct, because you have the stacked, you have the crystalline phase of benzene. The rings are stacked in a certain direction. So the idea is that under pressure, they're gonna pursue that path and start bonding to each other. These pressures are in the range of 20 gigapascal, I think 25 gigapascal. They are quite high pressures, very high pressures. And in the beginning, they could produce some other structures, but as soon as you release the pressure, the material would get amorphous or get back to benzene. Now, with the way they are doing, they can put the pressure, remove the pressure, and at the end, you can see in the microscope and many techniques, you can see the filaments from the bundles of filaments of the nanothreads. So I think that's the reason they have a protocol, synthesis protocol that's quite complex. I think that's the reason there are not much groups able to do that yet. Most of the groups are able to achieve amorphous samples. So I think it's a matter of time that more and more groups can learn how to do these materials, and then we can think about possible applications. But as I said, the good thing about the simulation, we can do everything in the computer, know not a lot about them, and we leave the hard work for the experimentalists. We do the easy.
Thanks.
Fred, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. We had to postpone, but it was a pleasure, and I hope that we can get together soon in a conference again. Not only for scientific purposes, but to get together, have a good talk.
Have some beer and cachaça.
Yeah, some cachaça. Maybe the next Sieve Termo, we will get together again. We hope so.
I hope so.
Thank you very much for the invitation again. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for the talk. Thank you for the nice talk.